The first time German pilots saw the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, they sneered. The Luftwaffe's veterans, who had flown sleek Messerschmitts and nimble Focke-Wulfs, dismissed the massive American fighter as a joke. It was too big, too heavy, too clumsy looking. Surely, they thought, this lumbering brute could never threaten them in the skies above Europe. But the laughter didn't last long. For when the Thunderbolt opened fire, its 8.50 caliber Browning machine gun spat a storm of lead that shredded anything unlucky enough to be in its sights. German pilots who once mocked the Jug, as Americans called it, soon feared its relentless firepower and its uncanny ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. This is the story of how a fighter mocked as a flying barrel became one of the most feared aircraft of World War II. A tale of size, strength, and firepower that turned ridicule into respect, and forever etched the P-47 Thunderbolt into the legend of aerial warfare. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled out onto airfields in 1942, even American pilots looked at it with doubt. The aircraft loomed large, dwarfing nearly every other fighter of its time. Its nose was dominated by the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine, one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. Its fuselage was thick, its wings wide, and its overall bulk earned it the nickname, the Jug. To many, it looked less like a thoroughbred fighter and more like an overweight brute that had somehow sprouted wings. Across the Atlantic, German pilots who prided themselves on flying sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s laughed openly when they first heard of the Jug. Reports filtering through intelligence channels described it as heavy, ungainly, and surely incapable of challenging the Luftwaffe's mastery of European skies. At first glance, their ridicule seemed justified. Compared to the sharp-nosed 109 or the agile Spitfire, the P-47 looked like a flying barrel. It was almost twice as heavy as many fighters already in combat. For men who had been trained to equate speed and maneuverability with survival, the very idea of climbing into such a beast seemed absurd. Yet behind the ungainly silhouette lay something remarkable. That oversized radial engine could deliver more than 2,000 horsepower, propelling the Jug to speeds over 430 miles per hour, especially at high altitudes where German engines often struggled. Its thick skin and rugged airframe, though mocked as excessive, meant the Thunderbolt could absorb punishment and keep flying when other fighters would be spiraling to the ground. The plane was a product of necessity. In 1940 and 1941, as the Luftwaffe dominated the skies over Europe, American designers faced the harsh reality that their existing fighters could not compete. Alexander Cardvelli, the chief engineer at Republic Aviation, believed that the answer was not to build something lighter and more nimble, but to build something tougher and more powerful. He envisioned an aircraft that could climb to high altitudes with bomber formations, dive faster than anything else in the air, and unleash a storm of firepower so overwhelming that no enemy could ignore it. The P-47 was the realization of that vision. Still, convincing others of its worth would not be easy. Early test flights raised eyebrows. The aircraft drank fuel at an alarming rate, limiting its range. Its takeoff roll was long and ungainly, demanding steady hands from pilots. On the ground, its massive size made it cumbersome to handle. Critics wondered whether this machine was really the answer America needed. In England, where the U.S. 8th Air Force prepared to bring the war to Germany, the first Thunderbolts arrived to mixed reviews. Pilots accustomed to nimble fighters found the controls heavy and the aircraft sluggish in tight turns. Jokes spread quickly, with some pilots saying it fought like a dump truck with wings. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was at the height of its power. Its veteran pilots, blooded in Spain, Poland, and France, flew the Bf-109 and the Fw-190 with deadly skill. These fighters were fast, agile, and battle-proven, and they had humbled the vaunted RAF Spitfires in dogfights across the Channel. When word spread that the Americans were bringing a giant, barrel-bodied fighter into the skies, laughter rippled through German squadrons. Surely, this cumbersome Jug would be easy prey. What few realized was that the P-47's design carried advantages that were not immediately obvious. Its weight gave it momentum in dives, allowing it to plummet faster than German fighters could follow. Its radial engine, with no vulnerable liquid cooling system, meant it could take hits to the front and keep running, unlike the inline engines of its adversaries. And then there was its armament, 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. Each fired at a blistering rate, and together they could hurl a wall of lead dense enough to shred even the toughest aircraft. At a time when most fighters carried 2 or 4 guns, the Thunderbolt's arsenal was unprecedented. The irony was thick. German pilots who ridiculed the Jug's bulk had no idea that those oversized wings were needed to carry the weight of 8 Brownings and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They had not yet faced the experience of being caught in the cone of fire that the P-47 could unleash. To them, it was still a lumbering curiosity, an experiment unlikely to last long in the brutal skies over occupied Europe. But to the Americans preparing for the battles to come, the Thunderbolt represented a new philosophy of air warfare. It was not about turning tighter circles than the enemy, it was about diving faster, hitting harder, and enduring more punishment. Even on the ground, the Jug began to inspire a grudging respect among those who worked with it. Maintenance crews marveled at its rugged design, its ease of repair, and its ability to take abuse. Pilots who stuck with it discovered that, while it was no ballerina in the sky, it was steady, reliable, and had power to spare when flown the right way. The Jug was not meant to win by elegance, it was meant to win by sheer force. As 1943 approached, the stage was set for the Thunderbolt's first true test. The Luftwaffe still controlled the airspace over France and Germany, confident that their agile fighters and seasoned aces would continue to rule the skies. American bombers, vital for striking deep into the Reich, were vulnerable without escorts that could stand toe-to-toe with German interceptors. The P-47 was about to be thrown into this arena, mocked by its enemies and doubted by some of its own, its reputation yet to be written. The first Thunderbolts to arrive in Britain in early 1943 looked out of place alongside the sleeker Spitfires and Mustangs that shared the airfields. The American pilots who strapped into them felt the weight of expectation and skepticism. Their mission was clear: escort the heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into enemy territory, protecting them from the swarms of German fighters that had been cutting bomber formations to pieces. Yet few believed the bulky Jug could truly meet the challenge. For the Luftwaffe, it seemed like confirmation of their belief that the Americans were naive. The baptism of fire came swiftly. In April 1943, the P-47 flew its first combat missions over occupied France. German pilots scrambled to intercept, eager to face this new opponent. When they first caught sight of the Thunderbolt in the air, their initial impression matched what they had already heard from intelligence reports: it was enormous, larger even than some bombers. They laughed over the radio, calling it clumsy prey. They believed one-turn fight would be enough to send the Jug spiraling down in flames. What they had not counted on was the raw power hidden beneath its ungainly shape. As the first engagements unfolded, American pilots discovered the Jug's personality in combat. It was not nimble, and any attempt to outturn a Bf-109 or Fw-190 usually ended badly. But when flown to its strengths, the Thunderbolt revealed astonishing abilities. It could dive faster than any German aircraft, its heavy frame pulling it down like a hammer. German pilots who attempted to follow often found themselves in dangerous compressibility, their controls locking up while the Jug leveled out smoothly at breakneck speed. More than one Luftwaffe ace miscalculated and never pulled out of such dives, paying with their lives for underestimating the American brute. Then there was the firepower. 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, spat out more than 100 rounds per second. A short burst from a Thunderbolt ripped across the sky like a buzzsaw, and anything caught in the cone of fire was shredded. In those early fights, Luftwaffe pilots learned the hard way what it meant to be on the receiving end. Fuselages tore open, wings disintegrated, and cockpits exploded in showers of sparks as the Jugs poured lead into their enemies. The Germans who had mocked the Jug's bulk realized that its size gave it room to carry an arsenal unmatched by anything in the air. American pilots, too, grew more confident as they adjusted their tactics. They stopped trying to turn with their adversaries and instead climbed high with the bombers, using altitude as their advantage. From above, they dove like thunderbolts, the name now fitting in more ways than one, tearing through enemy formations in slashing attacks before zooming back upward. German fighters that tried to pursue found themselves outrun in a dive and outgunned when caught in the Jug's sights. Slowly, the narrative began to change. The same pilots who had once doubted the Thunderbolt now spoke of its toughness with respect. Stories circulated of Jugs returning from missions riddled with holes, their engines coughing smoke, yet still landing safely. One Thunderbolt came home with an entire cylinder head missing from its radial engine, a feat no inline-engined Messerschmitt could ever have survived. For the Luftwaffe, these encounters were sobering. They had laughed at the Jug's weight and bulk, but now they feared its resilience. They could hit it again and again, only to watch it continue flying, its pilots still pressing the attack. To German aces accustomed to quick kills against fragile adversaries, the Thunderbolt was an infuriating opponent. Reports to headquarters shifted in tone, from ridicule to frustration. They described an aircraft that could not be easily shot down, that struck with devastating firepower, and that punished any pilot reckless enough to underestimate it. Meanwhile, American bomber crews began to feel the difference. At first, their formations had suffered terrible losses, unprotected against swarms of interceptors. But with the Thunderbolt flying high above them, German attacks were blunted. The Jug might not have had the range yet to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, but in the skies over France and the Low Countries it was proving itself as a shield. Crews cheered when they saw the stubby-winged fighters escorting them, knowing that these brutes could dish out punishment and take it in return. Combat footage and after-action reports quickly spread through Allied command, showcasing both the strengths and weaknesses of the new fighter. Tactics were refined: never dogfight, always dive, use altitude, unleash the 8.50s in short, controlled bursts. Pilots compared the sound of the Jug's guns to rolling thunder, the kind of roar that rattled even the most experienced Luftwaffe ace. German propaganda tried to dismiss the P-47 as cumbersome, but the losses told another story. Day by day, the Thunderbolt was carving a reputation in blood and fire. The summer of 1943 marked the true turning point. Missions grew bolder, bomber raids pressed deeper, and the Jug met the challenge each time. American pilots now flew with swagger, painting nose art and giving their aircraft names, proud to be Jug drivers. The German laughter had grown quiet. Instead, there was a grudging respect in the enemy's reports, a recognition that the Americans had introduced a fighter that could not be ignored. What began as a baptism of fire was quickly becoming a legend in the making. When pilots spoke of the P-47 Thunderbolt's greatest strength, they didn't begin with its speed or its size. They spoke of its guns. 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, mounted in each wing, gave the Jug a firepower unmatched by any other single-engine fighter of the war. Each weapon was capable of firing over 750 rounds per minute, and when all 8 unleashed their fury in unison, the effect was devastating. In the air, it sounded like rolling thunder, an ear-splitting roar that filled the cockpit and left pilots with ringing ears even under their helmets. On the receiving end, it meant annihilation. German fighters that once scoffed at the Jug quickly learned to respect its sting. A single burst could shred through a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf, tearing wings apart, slicing through engines, and turning cockpits into showers of glass and metal. Pilots who were caught in the Jug's sights often never had the chance to radio a warning. Survivors described the streams of tracer fire as blinding curtains of light that closed in too fast to escape. One Luftwaffe pilot later admitted that once a Thunderbolt opened fire, you could feel the sky itself shaking with the weight of its bullets. The Jug's designers had understood that firepower was more than a luxury, it was a necessity. American bomber crews flew deep into German territory, and their survival depended on escort fighters that could kill enemy interceptors quickly. A lightly armed plane might chase an enemy away, but a Thunderbolt destroyed it outright. That difference mattered when hundreds of bombers depended on their escort for protection. Pilots soon realized that when they pressed the trigger, the Jug didn't just discourage enemy attacks, it erased them. The battles of 1943 and 1944 provided vivid demonstrations of what 8.50s could do. Thunderbolt pilots reported slicing through entire formations with rapid slashing attacks. A single dive could scatter German fighters, some trailing smoke and others exploding midair as the Jug thundered past. The firepower was so concentrated that even heavy bombers, if caught by mistake in the Jug's sights, could be torn apart. Stories circulated of pilots accidentally damaging their own bomber formations when their aim slipped by a fraction. The guns demanded precision, but when applied correctly, they left no doubt. The German high command began to take notice. Reports flooded in from frontline squadrons describing the lethality of the new American fighter. The FW-190, once considered the terror of the skies, could not endure the Jug's firepower. Even when a German pilot outmaneuvered the Thunderbolt, he risked being caught in a devastating head-on pass. Unlike most Allied fighters, which carried 2 or 4 guns, the Jug could unleash a storm in a single second of fire that rivaled an entire squadron of smaller planes. Luftwaffe pilots began warning each other not to underestimate the flying fortress of a fighter. The P-47's ruggedness only enhanced its lethality. Pilots could close in and hold their fire longer than other fighters because they trusted their aircraft to withstand return shots. The radial engine could absorb hits and keep running, allowing Jug drivers to press the attack at ranges that shocked their opponents. German pilots who expected Thunderbolts to break away instead found themselves hammered by a wall of lead until their planes disintegrated. More than one Luftwaffe ace wrote in frustration about the Jug's stubbornness, describing it as a monster that cannot be killed in the air. Tales of its firepower spread quickly among American squadrons. Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who became one of the top American aces, swore by the Jug's guns, crediting them for his long string of victories. Robert S. Johnson, another ace, described how he once emptied nearly all his ammunition into a German plane that refused to go down, until finally the Jug's .50s tore the enemy to pieces. These stories were passed along in mess halls and briefing rooms, feeding the legend of the Jug as a beast of war. Even when used against ground targets, the 850s were merciless. Pilots strafing convoys reported trucks and tanks erupting in flames under concentrated fire. Locomotives exploded into twisted wreckage. German soldiers on the ground came to dread the scream of the Jug diving overhead, followed by the tearing rip of its machine guns. The Thunderbolt's ability to devastate both air and ground targets made it one of the most versatile and feared weapons in the Allied arsenal. For bomber crews flying over occupied Europe, the Jug's guns became a symbol of survival. They watched as Thunderbolts tore into enemy interceptors, reducing the pressure on their formations. The sight of Luftwaffe fighters breaking apart under the Jug's relentless fire gave them confidence that they might make it home alive. Where once the German pilots laughed, they now approached combat with caution. The thunder that rolled out of the Jug's wings silenced the jokes and replaced them with grim respect. In the mess halls of the Luftwaffe, pilots who had mocked the American brute now spoke in hushed tones about its killing power. They still prized their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs for agility, but they knew that a single mistake against a Thunderbolt could mean instant death. The balance of fear had shifted. The Jug, with its 850s, had proven that firepower could be just as decisive as maneuverability. The war in the skies over Europe would never be the same again. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer just a fighter dueling in the skies above Europe. It had become a war machine, a tool of destruction that carried its reputation from high-altitude battles to the very roads and railways of the Reich. Its evolution was born out of necessity. The Allies needed not only to sweep the skies clear but also to cripple the German war machine on the ground, shattering its ability to move troops, fuel, and supplies. The Jug, with its size, power, and ruggedness, was uniquely suited to that role. Pilots who had once used the Thunderbolt to shred Messerschmitts soon found themselves strafing trains, convoys, and armor across France and Germany. The same 8.50 caliber machine guns that had turned enemy fighters into flaming wrecks now ripped through columns of trucks and half-tracks. Locomotives exploded in showers of sparks and smoke when Jug pilots caught them racing down the rails. Soldiers on the ground described the terrifying sound, the scream of the dive, followed by the hammering thunder of the guns, a sound that signaled death from above. Even tanks, which might shrug off small arms fire, were vulnerable when Jugs added bombs or high-velocity rockets to their arsenal. The Thunderbolt's bulk, once mocked, became its greatest advantage in this new role. Its sturdy frame could absorb the flak that peppered the skies over every German column and airfield. Many fighters were too lightly built to endure repeated ground attack missions, but the Jug returned again and again, wings and fuselage riddled with holes yet still airworthy. Pilots told stories of limping home with entire sections of their planes missing, convinced that no other aircraft could have survived the punishment. The Germans, who had once dismissed it as slow and clumsy, began calling it nearly indestructible. Nowhere was its transformation more evident than during the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944. As Allied troops pushed inland from the beaches, the Jug flew constant sorties, sometimes 5 or 6 missions a day. They scoured the hedgerows, pounding hidden German positions with machine gun fire and 500-pound bombs. Columns of German reinforcements trying to reach the front were mauled by Thunderbolts before they ever arrived. Pilots described the fields of France as killing grounds, where the Jug reigned supreme. One officer quipped that if a German soldier saw a Jug overhead, his safest move was to dig as deep a hole as possible. For the men on the ground, both friend and foe, the Jug's presence was unforgettable. Allied troops cheered when the big fighters roared low overhead, strafing enemy positions that had pinned them down. German soldiers, on the other hand, dreaded the distinctive silhouette. The Thunderbolt became known as the tank buster long before the P-47 successor, the P-47N, carried even heavier payloads. With bombs strapped under its wings and rockets slung beneath its fuselage, the Jug blurred the line between fighter and bomber. It could fight in the sky in the morning and level a railway yard in the afternoon. Allied commanders quickly realized they had found their workhorse. Squadrons of Thunderbolts became the hammer that pounded Germany's infrastructure day after day. Bridges collapsed under their attacks, fuel depots went up in flames, and ammunition trains erupted in spectacular explosions. This constant pressure bled the German army of its mobility, forcing it to fight closer to its supply bases and robbing it of the ability to mount large counteroffensives. In many cases, the Jug's destructive power on the ground proved just as decisive as its protection of bombers in the air. What made this transformation all the more remarkable was the Jug's ability to switch roles seamlessly. One day it might climb with bomber formations to 25,000 feet, tangling with the Luftwaffe in high-altitude duels. The next, it would skim the treetops, strafing convoys with the same ferocity. Few aircraft of the war demonstrated such versatility. Pilots appreciated that they could take on whatever mission the day demanded, confident that their rugged Jug would bring them back. The Germans tried to adapt. Flak batteries were reinforced, camouflaged convoys moved at night, and rail lines were repaired almost as quickly as they were destroyed. But the relentless pace of Thunderbolt missions made it impossible to keep up. Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed at the American brute now spoke bitterly of its omnipresence. Even when they avoided dogfights with the Jug, they could not avoid its wrath on the ground. The aircraft had become not only a fighter but a scourge, attacking with a ferocity that ground commanders could not ignore. Accounts from German prisoners painted a picture of dread. Some described hearing the roar of a Jug long before seeing it, knowing that the next moments might bring destruction. Others spoke of entire units pinned down by strafing runs, unable to move for hours. The psychological impact of the Jug was as potent as its physical destruction. Just as the Luftwaffe had once inspired fear with its Stuka dive bombers early in the war, now the Allies had their own aerial terror, and it came in the form of a fighter once dismissed as too big to matter. For American pilots, the Jug's transformation into a war machine carried its own sense of pride. They painted bold nose art, gave their planes names, and swapped stories of impossible returns and spectacular strikes. Each mission added to the legend: locomotives ripped apart, tanks smoldering, convoys scattered, enemy airfields reduced to chaos. The Jug had proven it could do far more than dogfight. It could break the enemy's ability to fight at all. By the closing months of 1944, the laughter that once echoed through Luftwaffe ready rooms at the mention of the Thunderbolt had vanished. The P-47 had carved its place into the war not as a clumsy oddity, but as a juggernaut of destruction. Its pilots now flew with the confidence of men who knew their machine could outfight, outlast, and outgun almost anything the enemy could send against them. For the Germans, the bulky silhouette that once drew ridicule now triggered dread. Among the pilots who gave the Jug its fearsome reputation were names that became legendary. Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, flying his P-47 HVA, tore through the Luftwaffe with a string of victories that made him America's leading ace in Europe. Robert S. Johnson, another early champion of the Jug, returned from one mission with more than 200 bullet holes in his aircraft, his canopy jammed shut, and his controls half destroyed, yet the Jug still brought him home. Tales like these spread quickly, building the mythology of a fighter that could not be killed. For bomber crews who looked to their escorts with desperate hope, knowing men like Gabreski and Johnson flew Thunderbolts was reassurance enough to keep climbing into the skies over Germany. The Thunderbolt's reach also grew with each passing month. As drop tanks extended its range, the Jug began flying deeper into enemy territory, escorting bombers further than ever before. Now it wasn't only the edges of France or the Low Countries that lay under its shadow, Berlin itself felt the presence of the Jug's escorts overhead. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, was forced to meet the Jug again and again, often with green pilots rushed into cockpits after only a few hours of training. Against seasoned American squadrons, flying machines that could shrug off punishment and return it with interest, these rookies stood little chance. On the ground, the Jug's legend grew just as fast. German civilians and soldiers alike learned to recognize its howl as it dove on rail yards and convoys. Resistance fighters in occupied countries whispered about the guardian angels that shredded enemy transports and slowed the flow of reinforcements. By the time Allied troops crossed into Germany itself, the Jug had become more than a fighter, it was a symbol of the relentless pressure the Reich could not withstand. The American advance was always accompanied by the roar of thunderbolts overhead, laying waste to anything that moved on the roads below. The irony of its transformation was not lost on those who had once doubted it. In briefing rooms across England, pilots remembered their first encounters with the Jug, how awkward it felt in the air, how ungainly it seemed in tight turns. Now those same pilots bragged of its firepower, its speed in a dive, its armor that seemed to shrug off flak. They decorated their planes with names and nose art, each Jug carrying a personality as distinctive as its pilot. Squadrons took pride in their kill counts and in the destruction they left across Europe's railways and highways. The plane once mocked as too big had become the fighter everyone wanted to fly. For German pilots, the shift was bitter. Early in the war, they had dismissed Allied fighters as second-rate, lacking the finesse and lethality of the Bf-109 or Fw-190. Now, facing the Jug, they found themselves on the defensive, dodging streams of firepower that seemed impossible to escape. Even hardened aces admitted that the Thunderbolt was an enemy unlike any they had faced before. One Luftwaffe veteran described the Jug as a monster in the sky, slower to turn but impossible to kill. That grudging respect was the final proof that the days of laughter were over. The Thunderbolt's unexpected legacy stretched beyond the war itself. Long after victory in Europe, the Jug continued to serve in air forces around the world, its toughness and reliability making it a valuable tool in nations rebuilding from the conflict. In Latin America, in Asia, and even in the early stages of the Cold War, the P-47 flew on. The very qualities that had once drawn ridicule, its size, its ruggedness, its sheer brute force, made it adaptable to roles far beyond dogfights over Europe. It became a training platform, a ground attack aircraft, even a showpiece of American engineering in foreign service. For those who had flown it in anger, the Jug was remembered with a mix of pride and awe. Pilots spoke of how it had saved their lives, how it had turned the tide of missions, how it had given them the confidence to fight an enemy that once seemed untouchable. The bond between man and machine was strong, forged in fire and tempered in steel. In memoirs and interviews, veterans rarely failed to smile when recalling their Thunderbolts. They spoke of its quirks, its heavy controls, its fuel-guzzling engine, but above all, they remembered its resilience and its guns, the 850s that had silenced German laughter forever. The transformation of the Jug from laughingstock to legend was a story that mirrored the larger war. Underestimated at first, dismissed as clumsy, it proved itself through relentless determination, brutal efficiency, and the courage of the men who flew it. In the end, the P-47 stood not only as a weapon of war but as a reminder that appearances deceive, and that sometimes the most unlikely machines leave the deepest mark on history. In war, appearances deceive. The P-47 Thunderbolt, ridiculed as too heavy, too slow, too ungainly, proved that strength and firepower could rewrite the rules of combat. Its 8.50s turned the sky into a killing ground, its durability made it a juggernaut, and its pilots forged it into legend. German laughter died in the roar of Thunderbolt guns. And in the end, the Jug did more than win respect, it helped win the war.